And one of the things that I like most about documentaries is that, well, no matter how amazing they seem, you can't deny that they're true. It's where if you see a movie that seems to be stretching credibility, you can always sort of sit back and say, but that didn't happen. And what I really like about documentaries is that it actually did. So tonight we're going to show you a few clips from Daring Women Doctors. But prior to that, I'll just explain sort of the journey that I took to make this film. Essentially, it started out, I lived a long time in California, but now that I'm in Florida, it's good to sort of look for story ideas locally. And I happened to come across one when I was in Thomasville, visiting a Black museum there, a small Black museum in Thomasville, Georgia. And I was looking around, and it had a lot of, interesting, artifacts and articles and things over history. And I came across a picture of a woman called Dr. Eliza Greer. And she was an African-American woman who, had become a doctor in the 19th century. She'd been born enslaved, and she had gone on to go to Fisk University, and then on to and then she became a doctor. So I thought, well, that's amazing. How in the world do you get to do that if you've been born a slave? And so I thought initially, and I still do think I want to make this into an actual movie, so a narrative version of this. But first I thought, let me first do the research, so I might as well try to make a documentary first as sort of a proof of concept. So first, it was mostly about Eliza Greer. And one of the things I learned about her was that in order to support herself through medical school, she would go to medical school for 1 year, then she'd come south and pick cotton for a year, then go to medical school, and back and forth like that until it took her like 8 years to finish. And then she did practice in Atlanta and in Thomasville. And so I thought, well, where did she go to medical school anyway? I mean, it would be very unusual for an African-American woman to go to medical school, any woman, but certainly an African-American woman. And that's when I discovered the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. And I discovered that that school had started in 1850. So 10 years before the Civil War, and long before women would get the right to vote. And at that time, women couldn't own property. Women were like children, almost in terms of their legal rights. And so I thought, well, how did this school come to be? And so the school ended up lasting for 100 years. So until 1970 when it went co-ed. So I thought, that's amazing, that there's this all women's medical college that lasted so long. So I became interested in, what was the convergence of things that, oops, a little water. What was the convergence of things that would lead to this medical school starting? And it turned out that in my research, it was sort of a convergence of Quakers who had long been, or some of them had long been abolitionists, and also sort of believed, in some ways had inherent more rights for women within their faith, because they're non-hierarchical, and they also believed in the inner light of each individual. So some Quaker gentlemen thought, well, why can't my sister become a doctor? And then the other thing that led into that was the abolitionist movement itself, where women came to understand that as they advocated for the enslaved, that no one really paid much attention to them in terms of their petitions, because since they couldn't vote, politicians could throw their petitions in the trash. So there was that idea that women needed to sort of have a stronger voice, have a real voice. And that was also converged. So some women in the women's rights movement converged with the making of this medical school. So all that to say, once I got to understanding the school, and then also medicine at that time was also changing. It had gone from it being sort of the humors and different things, in the air that sort of made you feel sick, became a sort of more organized medical practices. Because at that time there was different types. There was, well, there's always been homeopathy, and that's still with us, homeopathic medicine. But there was some movement on the American Medical Association to move towards allopathic medicine. So away from things like the water cure or other types of cures that people felt were just more like quackery. So at the same time that all of these things were happening, it sort of converged to help to create an allopathic medical school. So that was so I came to realize that Eliza Greer, back to the first woman who I saw, was only going to be a part of the story at this point. And I had a sort of now a broader idea of looking at the history of these medical schools, which seem to have had a sort of blossoming time from 1850 to about 1900. And then for a few reasons, they started to either be absorbed into other schools or closed. And again, I would mention that the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania did last for a century. So there's such a wealth of material in the school and in the women in it. So I think the next thing we should probably do, Lacey, is to show people a little bit of the documentary. And then we can sort of see if anybody has any questions, or I'll sort of talk about what it shows.
Okay. And which one did you want to show first?
I think the one about the women's spheres.
So number 1, okay.
Yeah.
While Anne Preston and other reformers were advocating for women to expand the traditional spheres for women, much of society was resistant to the idea of women seeking professions on par with men.
There were women who certainly were against suffrage and who were against careers for women and who were against women doctors. Those women do exist. And part of the reason they exist is that they take a more traditional view of the role of women, that women are specially suited to be in the domestic sphere, and they are higher, more moral, and more noble than men. Men are out in the muck and the mire of the world, whereas women are able to be free of that by concentrating on this domestic sphere of home and family, that they can create a safe space and a pure space for their children to grow up in and for their husband to find refuge in. That would be a very traditional view, and many historians call this the notion of separate spheres, that men had a sphere, the world, and women had a sphere, the home, and that it was better to stay that way.
Letter from the wife at home. It is within the circle of her domestic assiduity that we must go to judge of the true worth of a woman, to make a correct estimate of her forbearance, her virtue, and her felicity. Godey's Ladies' Book and Magazine.
One of the big arguments against women being physicians was the idea that if women became physicians, then men would have to take on women's roles. You did women's roles, or you did men's roles. And once women did men's roles, then men would have to do women's roles. So they posited this whole role reversal thing. There were also questions about, like, what kind of a mother are you going to be if you have to go take house calls at night? You're not going to be there for your child. Somebody even said, how can you give your child good breast milk if you're worried about your patients? How could these women be good wives? How could they take care of their husbands and their families if they had other responsibilities outside the house? And so there was a real question about, would women still be women? Would they still fill those social roles if they were also practicing medicine?
Women possess a peculiar trait. It is modesty, and is one of the most charming of their attributes, springing probably from their natural timidity and sense of dependence. All rude, boisterous, and immodest speech or action unsexes and disgraces her. This modesty is one of the strongest of her attractions. She has a head almost too small for intellect, but just big enough for love. Charles D. Meigs, M.D.
Should one half of the world be educated as though they had minds, and the other half as though they had not? We are not of those who admit that man enjoys any such superiority, or that woman is his inferior.
Some women held that women's sphere was where God placed them. And so they used religious ideas, which they wholeheartedly believed, to hold that whatever activity they felt called to do, that defined what women's sphere was. Women might hold that activities like becoming a woman physician and treating women and children was just an extension of domestic life. After all, almost all home medical care was being given by women already, and this was just an extension of that.
Women have always been part of the medical community. So if you even go pre-1850, women have always been nurses at the bedside, they've been midwives, they've been assistants to doctors. So women were often, as mothers, as wives, as daughters, charged with taking care of the health of themselves and their family. They were doctoring at home, so they were helping birth babies. They were mixing herbs from their herb garden and creating tinctures to treat their children who happen to have sore throats. In some ways, women who want to become doctors are part of this long line of women who are charged with being healers because of their gender and their place in society. Some women moving into the medical sphere argued that because of their womanly sensibilities, they had a kind of privileged place in the world of medicine. So their job was to take care of the home, their job was to think about how to heal the people who are inside of it. So what better thing to do than get a medical education and be able to bring that natural sensibility, the natural feminine sensibility to the wider world. I'm still going to be nurturing, I'm still going to be a good woman. Just the audience for that nurturing is bigger than my own family. I'm taking care of my patients in my own community. They were really adamant that they were still women, that nothing could change the kind of inherent essential nature of their womanliness. For the first time in general, women are interested in going and getting an education that many men had during this time period. And many ambitious women, many religious women, many women who had support from their families thought becoming a physician was a good way of both having an interesting profession and having a profession that fit with their own morals and values and interests as a Christian woman or as a woman. And there are other women who really pushed back against it and wanted to say, you know what, I don't need to necessarily be associated just with the home. I'm an ambitious, career-minded person, and I want to have a public life that is also incredibly rich and detach it from this idea that women are naturally homemakers or naturally wives and daughters. So you have some people going into medicine really because it was the feminine for them, the feminine thing to do. And some people going into medicine saying, I don't want to just be known as a lady doctor, I want to be known as a doctor with full stop.
Okay, so oh, somebody was saying that they couldn't hear that well. Did you see that, Lacey?
I did, and I will turn it up on the next one.
Okay. All right, so so that first section was you know, part of the journey that these women had to take in terms of it was such a disruption of how society viewed them. Now, of course, these were women who had the opportunity to stay home. You know, of course, there were a lot of women who had to work no matter what, you know, based on their economic, social, economic level. But for the women who had the option to stay home, it did seem to be, you know, a bit of a crazy notion, you know, back then for women to, you know, voluntarily exit the sphere. And one of the things that the women did, especially, you know, at the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania and these other ones, was to assure people and to use this door of the door of that that taking care of people, you know, nursing people at home or in general in the family was just an extension of what women did anyway. And also, wouldn't a woman rather have a female doctor attend her for her, you know, birthing issues or feminine issues? You mean? So I think that there was definitely, and that's probably why, you know, at that point we have, you know, such a large number of women who are in the OBGYN area, and has always been the door in for women at this period of time to practice. Although, of course, women would, when they graduated, would find careers in many different ways. One of the things that women would find, and I know there was actually a TV series, you know, Dr. Quinn, American Medicine Woman, which maybe some of you saw. Well, she actually did go, that character did attend the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania. And for a number of the women who were looking for work and maybe couldn't find it, going west or going somewhere where there was a dearth of doctors made people accept them more willingly and you know, as opposed to preferring a male doctor. And some women would go and work at female institutions. So whether it was a mental institution or a female, school or a woman's prison, that was also something. And there were certainly a number of women who just went into rural practices or would work in the cities. I mean, there was a woman, an African-American woman graduate, Rebecca Cole, and another white woman graduate who started up a practice in Pennsylvania, working in Philadelphia, working with single mothers. So there was like a big variety. And also there would be women who became missionaries, which was always amazing to me that in that century, you would just get on a ship and go off to some country, India or some country in Africa or in China and start up a mission, which would of course be both religious as well as medical, and start hospitals. Some of these hospitals are still in existence today. And some, I should add, of the women who came to school came from other countries. So they would learn about the school. And so the idea that women caring for women would fit with a lot of different countries' cultures. So there were women from India and from Thailand and from Japan and all who came to learn at this medical college, as well as others. So I think we could show another section unless anybody has any questions about what they've seen thus far. Or if you do, Lacey.
No, I don't have any questions.
Okay.
Which one would you like to show?
I think we'll show, so now we talked about how or I showed you something about like societal attitudes that they had to deal with in terms of trying to negotiate acceptance for women. And I think the second one will show sort of about the sort of like day-to-day challenges of actually sort of going through medical school. So we'll look at that.
Despite the opposition to women expanding their sphere, many women entered these medical schools to become physicians. However, the challenges these women faced would continue even while in the colleges themselves.
So a lot of these early generations of women interested in pursuing medicine enter into classrooms where men are hazing them. So there are a lot of historians who write about how male students would throw things at them during anatomy lectures. They would jeer and boo them if they happened to be learning about the male body or the female body. So there was hostility and harassment in the classroom by their fellow male students. And there was also a kind of hostility or iciness on the part of some male faculty members who were really uninterested in teaching women as a student population.
There was a rash of episodes where women medical students who were attending lectures at which patients were treated, these were called clinical lectures, these women medical students were harassed and usually driven from the room. This happened in a number of places. It happened in London, it happened in Edinburgh, it happened in New York, and it also happened in Philadelphia. All of this seems to have something to do with the kind of way that people thought about looking at bodies in the 19th century. The same impulses that led, in a different way, that led women patients to say, I don't want male physicians seeing my genitals, led male medical students to say, I don't want to see women seeing men's legs.
The assistants brought forward a man with a broken thigh. The poor fellow was placed recumbent on a revolving couch, and the young doctors prepared to pull off his boots. The doctor had, however, prepared a blanket with which the patient was draped. In this case, while measuring the fractured limb, there was a momentary exposure which proved a signal for an explosion among the students. Mock applause, clapping, stamping, shouts of laughter, mingling with hisses and jeers in one wild uproar. The eyes of half the audience were on the lady students who sat calm and unruffled under the brutal treatment. The press.
It was a riot in that room. The women medical students left the room, and then they were followed in the street, which was really scandalous behavior to be followed in the street, and eventually just had to take refuge. There was a huge controversy over this.
It was an action that deprived every man in the crowd of all claim to the title of gentleman. If these women had given gross offense, if they had indulged in any unwomanly behavior, If they had intruded themselves in the hospital in violation of the rules, even then, there would have been no excuse for such infamous conduct as this on the part of the students. But these ladies had absolute right there. They were admitted by precisely the same authority that admits men, and more than this, it was right that they should accept the privilege offered them if they wished to do so. Evening Bulletin.
Because the idea of teaching women physiology, dissection, and anatomy, much less graduating them with an MD to practice medicine, one really has to go back in time and understand that that was a very heterodox notion.
We are not without very grave objections to women taking on themselves the heavy duties and responsibilities of the practice of medicine. Their success in the walks of general literature and even in some instances of science, which allow a choice of time and season for intellectual labor, cannot be adduced as an argument in favor of their ability to bear up under the bodily and mental strain to which they would increasingly be subjected in this new vocation. Philadelphia County Medical Society.
In civilized society, she is the nurse, keeping her unceasing vigils not only by the cradle of infancy, but by every bed of sickness and suffering with a power of sustained endurance that man does not even claim to possess. We come to the open, undeniable fact that women do practice medicine, that they are able to bear up under the bodily and mental strain that this practice imposes. Ann Preston. In response to this, the WMCP began to rely more on the women's hospital that was a part of the college. The hospital had been spearheaded by Ann Preston and opened its doors during the Civil War.
During the Civil War, the medical college was closed. They had no classes. And so what Preston did was to take all the resources of the women's medical school and use them to set up a hospital. But after the jeering incident, their reliance on the Women's Medical College Hospital really got much stronger. It was a long time before clinical lectures became available to women. Actually, hospital practice tended, at the hospital run by the Women's Medical College, tended to be the way that they got their firsthand experience with patients.
So Mary Jacobi was a very famous 19th century physician, and she was a doctor who was really interested in being trained in the latest science of the time. So whereas some women physicians were more interested in women's health, they were interested in childhood education, they were interested in educating other women about their bodies, Mary Jacobi really wanted to use the tools of male-dominated medicine against them, or to prove her point, which is that women should be able to practice medicine. She had a really advanced medical training for her time. She had gone to medical school in the United States, and then she took the extra step of going to Europe for some practical training. And so then she came back and she was ready to practice as a scientific physician. In the late second half of the 1800s, medicine is undergoing a really big change. So we have people wanting to test things rather than just say, well, this is the way it's always been done. She wanted women physicians to be just as scientific as men physicians were. She was not about to let lack of scientific expertise stand in the way of women physicians claiming the right to be physicians.
She looked upon the Women's Medical College as having given her her degree and her ability to move forward, which indeed she did. She became America's best-known woman medical scientist.
Edward Clark was a physician who was on faculty at Harvard Medical College. And in 1873, he published a book called Sex and Education, or A Fair Chance for the Girls. And in this book, he argued that the female reproductive system required so much energy to develop and maintain that any energy that was diverted from that process might lead to infertility or some other kind of like hysteria. One of the big drains on energy would be if you're going to school. So the energy would be going to your brain instead of to your reproductive system. Clark's argument was that men were built for constancy, so they could go to school all day, every day. And women's physiology was built on periodicity.
The results are monstrous brains and puny bodies, abnormally active cerebration, and abnormally weak digestion, flowing thought, and constipated bowels, lofty aspirations, and neuralgic sensations. Edward Clark.
At the time, women's sort of menstruation was a very hot topic among male doctors and women interested in medicine at the time. And so the idea was that during a woman's monthly cycle, she was going to be irritable or unstable and particularly fragile as a physiological object or as a human. So how could a woman enter into a medical system and be trained in a way that would allow her to work for only 3 weeks out of every month? So during her monthly cycle, for that whole week, she should be confined at home, and was used as a way to refuse to integrate women into the medical community.
As soon as Clark's book was published, there was just a ton of controversy in the periodical press at the time. People were saying everything from, finally, we have science to answer the woman question. This is going to resolve it all for us. And other people saying, well, you know what? Clark's science was actually not that scientific, because he had based his whole argument on 7 case studies that he had cherry-picked out of his doctor's notebook. The Boylston Committee offers the Boylston Prize for the best medical thesis. And so a few years after Clark's book was published, they set the question being, do women require rest during menstruation, and if so, to what extent? Mary Putnam Jacoby submitted her argument anonymously, refuting Clark.
Mary Putnam sends out a questionnaire to a set of women about what they do during menstruation, and publishes the results, which show that there are women who routinely walk 10 miles, do farm labor, and that they were no worse off than women who went to bed. And this, ta-da, wins the Boylston Prize.
Okay. So I think that, so in that section, and we have to, when you're making a documentary, obviously on such a long period of time and so many different women, you have to sort of pick and choose the women who you think will give you it will help you as a vehicle to sort of talk about the different types of women who went through and their different views and what was going on with medicine. And so in that sense, we were looking for the sort of events, which would be the jeering episode, which was one of the sort of famous episodes for that time period, when the women went to a lecture and the men sort of booed and hissed and seemed to have driven them out of the room. And in some ways, that actually helped with the attitude about women becoming physicians, because I think, at least in the press, people seem to be more upset with the fact that the men had been so rude to the women. And so in some ways, it shifted the conversation from whether the women should have been in those lectures in the first place. So that was sort of a difficult, but sort of helpful in a way in terms of shifting the conversation. Plus, it also led to the women recognizing that being booed and hissed at or being denied access to clinicals, which is obviously a big part of becoming a physician, was eroding their efforts to become doctors. So the idea that they would have their own hospital where they would treat mostly women, was really pivotal and would prove to be very important in why this particular school would last 100 years. In the turn of the century, around 1900, there would be the American Medical Association would commission a report by a man named Flexner, and he would sort of look at what was necessary for a medical school. And he felt that the medical school should all have, full labs, full hospital, scientific hospital, and all of these things that maybe some of these medical schools did not have. And maybe they were using somebody else's, facilities for these things. And these parameters ended up impacting some of these women's medical colleges, as well as African-American medical colleges as well. And so the numbers shrank, from being, to just a handful were remaining. And because of this, the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania had the Women's Hospital attached, that allowed them to sort of survive. And another thing that happened at the turn of the century was some medical schools started to admit women. One being Johns Hopkins, because they got a big grant, or they got a big donation of money from women, a few women in Baltimore who said, okay, we'll give you this money on the condition that you admit some women, and they did. And so in some ways women had more choices about where to go. But there are challenges of being a few women in a larger group of men, that some of these women's medical colleges allowed women to not have to negotiate that. Okay, so I think I have one other clip to show, and that one is going back to Eliza Greer. And so in the documentary, we spend a few minutes discussing the perspective of some African-American women who attended this college. I don't think I can hear anything though, Lacey. Were you able to share computer audio at the bottom? I mean, share the Zoom?
Yes, hang on just 1 second.
Have any kind of access.
There we go. Let me turn my audio up. Now. Is this the right video? Valerie?
It sounded like it. I can't see anything right this second.
Okay, you can't see it. Am I not sharing? Let me go back to sharing.
And at the bottom, it says share computer sound.
Yes. Share. Computer sound. Share.
Yeah, that should be it.
Okay.
Do you know of any possible way that might be provided for an emancipated slave to receive any help into so lofty a profession? If you cannot do otherwise, then give me a chance, a fair chance.
Eliza Greer would write this letter to Clara Marshall, the Dean of the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania.
What are the problems that African American women in particular faced? Well, they faced the problems of racism. Very few African American women have any kind of access to wealth. There are some, but they're not very many.
Eliza Greer would be admitted to this medical college and would succeed in attaining her medical degree some 7 years later.
So African Americans would have to often go to school for a semester and then work for a semester. Go to school for another semester and then work for a semester. So they would often have to support themselves and not be able to go through school just in a straight line.
Upon graduation, she would return to Atlanta to establish a practice. The newspaper headline would read, "A coal-black negress has been licensed to practice medicine by the Georgia Board of State Medical Examiners. She is the first colored woman admitted to practice in the state."
When I saw a colored woman doing all the work in cases of accouchement and all the fee going to some white doctor who merely looked on, I asked myself, why should I not get the fee myself?
In the 19th century, African American women entered into the medical profession in a variety of different ways. Historians talk about how enslaved women were apprenticed to medical practitioners in the antebellum South. This is like the 1830s, 1840s, early 1850s. And a number of enslaved women who happened to have abilities as healers, as midwives, were actually asked not only to take care of enslaved communities on plantations, but also to take care of white slave owners. So they entered into the healthcare profession somewhat under duress. So they were required non-consensually to take care of communities in their particular locations. And then there are other women who enter into medicine because they are interested later on in life. African American women would be trained in institutions like the New England Medical College or the Women's College of Philadelphia, and then they would return to Washington, D.C., to Georgia, to Black communities, and often sort of Black-owned hospitals to treat people back where they happened to be from.
Rebecca Cole was born into a middle-class Philadelphia family. As a physician, she was committed to poor communities. Following graduation, she found work with Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell at her New York infirmary.
Rebecca Cole was one of the earliest African-American women physicians, and she used her position to defend the African-American community from accusations that they were inherently more criminal or by nature more likely to fall victim to disease.
Now, who made these figures but men of a class who are so warped by that strange American disorder, colorphobia? Hosts of The Poor are attended by young, inexperienced white physicians. They have inherited their traditions of their elders, and let a Black patient cough, they immediately have visions of tuberculosis. Let him die. And though in the case there may be good reason for a difference of opinion, he writes, tuberculosis, and heaves a great sigh of relief that one more source of a contagion is removed. Rebecca Cole.
She has the status and the expertise as a physician to point out what these other professions are doing. So what her colleagues in medicine might be doing that might be racist, and what the police or the justice community might be doing.
So this early generation of women physicians, often called the pioneering generation, who were graduating from medical colleges in the late 1840s, 1850s, 1860s, there was a question of, once you graduate, like, what do you do? You know, do you just go put a shingle somewhere and say that you're open for business? Like, how do you do that? How do you rent a space? How do you convince your neighbors that you are serious about your work? And there are a series of letters between Emily Blackwell and Elizabeth Blackwell. Elizabeth Blackwell is trying to set up her practice in New York. She's like, no one's coming. Like, what do I do? No one is coming to my place of business.
A blank wall of social and professional antagonism faces the women physician that forms a situation of singular and painful loneliness, leaving her without support, respect, or professional counsel. Elizabeth Blackwell.
So there's not only this question of how you can path break and move into colleges and become a woman doctor. The next thing is to figure out, how do you create a career pathway for yourself out in the world where you're the only one? And so some of the ways that Elizabeth Blackwell and other people would navigate that is to find other men who would ally themselves with these women, who would vouch for them, who would send them patients. And another way that people would succeed is to specialize. So many of these women specialize in issues around women's health because that was a patient population that they could be sure not only to get, but also to be able to treat well. So there are all these complicated ways that just becoming a doctor doesn't mean you'll be successful in your career.
Some took the path of doing lectures on anatomy and physiology, mostly for women audiences, to address the widespread ignorance about how bodies worked, especially how women's bodies worked. Because they weren't going to school, because medical schools kind of monopolized the knowledge about health. And women weren't included in that audience for a long time. So one of the first things that women did when they got out of medical school was they wrote health advice and health information books. This was kind of their promise to society. This is what I owe society now that I've gone to medical school and earned this degree. These were important ways for women physicians to introduce themselves to the public. If the public had only heard the negative caricatures of women physicians that were circulating in the news, then they would think they are these mannish, hardened, unsexed women. But in their advice books, they could show themselves to be experts and knowledgeable at the same time that they expressed concern for their children or for women's health.
Rachel Bodley, dean of the WMCP in 1881, conducted a survey of the then 276 alumni. 189 responded, and of the 189, 166 stated that they were practicing medicine. She learned also that they were earning between $2,000 and $15,000 a year in income.
30 years ago, people used to say, if the woman physicians succeed, only large cities will be benefited because no women can ever endure the hardships of a country practice. This determined me to take a practice in the country, for I thought Alma Mater would be glad to have this obstacle removed. I bought a horse and a saddle, also $100 worth of medicine, and settled in a small village in Pennsylvania with the Susquehanna River on one side and mountains on the other. I often rode 10 miles in the night as well as in the day. I made friends, and my practice increased rapidly. The second year, I bought a carriage with side lamps, which was much more comfortable than riding on horseback. Everyone had a friendly greeting for me. The poor and rich alike opened their doors to me.
Susan LaFlèche. Susan was born on a reservation in Omaha and stated that she was inspired to become a doctor when she watched a Native American woman die because a white doctor refused to treat her. She would attend WMCP in 1889 before returning to reservations in Omaha and Nebraska, where she served 1,200 patients. She would marry and raise 2 sons and would succeed in opening a hospital in Nebraska.
Some of the women physicians married men who were very supportive of their work and became partners in it. And there were women whose husbands supported them but had separate practices, like Joseph and Hannah Longshore didn't have a joint practice.
Emmeline Horton Cleveland, she was married and had a child that was not unknown but was unusual, and her husband was, I believe, a clergyman who had some medical illness and was at some point virtually an invalid. So talk about balancing things in life. And there's a charming recollection by a student walking up the steps with her little son on her shoulder, getting ready to give her lecture.
Mary Putnam Jacoby, who married Abraham Jacoby, the father of American pediatrics, she had a son and a daughter, and there were women who never married, like Ann Preston.
Women didn't get married, they didn't necessarily have kids, they had sort of communal relationships with other women or other doctors that may or may not have been romantic, set up house, and they adopt children, and they have a very robust family life in the 19th century.
Harriet Hunt had a wedding anniversary with herself, where she talked about that she was celebrating the years that she had been married. Miss Harriet Hunt had been married to Dr. Harriet Hunt. And it's kind of a neat example of the social roles being combined in a woman physician, because she said, I'm still a woman, I'm still Miss Harriet Hunt, but there's this other side of me that is Dr. Harriet Hunt, that it's a professional that is out there in the world earning money.
Okay, well, I think that last clip sort of gives you sort of an overview of the types of some of the women who came through the medical school, as well as some of the challenges that they face afterwards. And mostly, I think, you know, they seem to be so intrepid, and as they say, such path breakers, that I think they all could work out to be a good part of my mini series that I'm planning to write for them one day. So I think that kind of, the only thing I would add would be that since this is the 100-year anniversary of women getting the right to vote, I would add that I believe that these women doctors helped in that movement. Not all of them were looking to get the right to vote, but many of them were. And that I think that even in 1852, one of the women doctors who helped to run the medical college in Pennsylvania was arguing for equal pay for equal work in the 1852 Women's Rights Convention in Pennsylvania. So I think they've long been a part of that struggle, and also just women being professionals and being doctors, of course, impacted how society viewed women. And so I believe that those women participating with the right to vote was significant. And Mary Jacoby, who was one of those women who definitely became a supporter in New York of women getting the right to vote. I believe that brings me to basically the end of this sharing.
Okay, guys, do you have any questions? Do you want to raise your hands or put it in the chat room or the Q&A? Anybody want to say anything? I know I would like for you to talk a little bit, Valerie, about how you keep your own biases out of your documentaries, because, you know, everything I was listening to, I just kept getting angrier and angrier. So I don't know how you can, you know, isolate your own opinions and feelings and just let it tell its own story.
What kind
do
of
that.
things are making you angry, do you think? Give me an example.
Well, just you know, the men's opinions, I guess, were making me angry about you know, things that women couldn't do and that kind of thing.
I see. Well, I think I guess because in a way it's, you know, movies are all about obstacles and facing obstacles and challenges, and it's all about the journey. You know, it's not about the moment. You know, so what I'm interested in is, you know, yes, you faced an obstacle, but if you resolved it, or if you were able to sort of surmount it, then that's what I'm paying attention to, really. Not that life was difficult, but that you figured out a way to make life better. You know what I mean? And so I think that's what, you know, if I thought that these people had stopped these women from becoming doctors, maybe I would get angry. But the fact that they pushed on, you know, it makes me sort of more interested in how they navigated that.
Oh, Patty wants to know what the tip jar is. Okay, I think I can do that. Ooh. There you go, Patty. There's a tip jar, and I can also put it on our website on the Mixology pages if you're interested in that. And Anne says thank you for the interesting presentation.
Sure. Thank you for attending, and it's going to be it's still available on PBS Passport. So if you're a PBS member, you can watch it there, watch the whole thing, and it's making its way to as I sort of work with PBS distribution, that it'll one day be available on Amazon, hopefully.
Yeah, I noticed it was streaming today. I checked it on today, and it was streaming. So, and I will be posting this on the museum's YouTube page and YouTube channel as soon as I can get it up and running. As soon as I get it recorded tonight, hopefully tomorrow. I do have a few of the previous lectures on our channel. About 8 of them, I think, I've got up so far. So if you want to check back and on our YouTube channel, I'll put that on our Mixology pages as well. So, oh, we have a question. What is your timing of the release of your plantation documentary?
Oh, yeah, I'm actually finishing that one up. That should be done. Well, our fine cut should be done this week coming up, actually. So next year, next spring, I would say, you know, the next couple, the first few months of the spring, I would hope that we'll be able to, hopefully again, you know, make a relationship with PBS, because they seem to be, well, I used to work at PBS, and who doesn't like PBS? You know what I mean? So, you know, so I think that would be my way to go. But I think pre-COVID, and even with COVID, obviously, with, you know, what Lacey's doing here, a lecture series, it has always been our plan to have screenings in Tallahassee with some of the people and institutions that have been supportive of it, you know, which would include the Tallahassee Museum, the Grove, the Goodwood, FAMU Archives. You know, I think we see it as a bit of a conversation starter, you know, so we've always imagined, you know, having a screening with a panel and people talking. So I would like it to be very much shown in the community as well.
Absolutely, we'd still be willing to do a screening in the spring. Of course, we're able to do it outdoors, so it's a little bit more COVID safe. So I'm sure the others could do it outdoors as well, but maybe they could do a little social distancing inside.
Yeah, that's true. I hadn't thought about outdoors, but yes, that's true. Yeah.
So, but we have a big screen and everything that we blow up and put outside, so we could do all that. Anybody else? Oh, we have lots of questions. Okay, good.
Will it be on PBS? I'm hoping it will. I have to submit it to them, and then they have to sort of say yay or nay. But One would hope that it would be, or certainly I'd hope that, Daring Women Doctors had like a national release. So it played in like maybe 95% of the stations that it could play in. And this other one, I will see if it's whether it's a regional interest or whether it's a national interest. Either one is fine with me. I just want to sort of get the conversation going. But I guess at that point, but hopefully, I'll keep you all posted. But regardless of where it would be broadcast, I would still plan to sort of share it with local partners and supporters.
Mm-hmm. Would you talk a little bit about the one I mentioned in the introduction, your Grenada one, and what?
Sure. That one. That one I completed a while ago, and that one, my father was born in Grenada and came to the United States and ended up marrying my mom and staying here and all. But we'd go to the Caribbean quite a bit, and actually he served in the Peace Corps for 4 years. So I'd been there for a while, and I visited for a while. And so going to Grenada, I was just always struck by how British people seem to be, they'd be the cultural clash between the sort of brash Americans and the British, And so I thought, how is this possible that these people are still, and so that led me to sort of wanting to sort of think about the legacy of colonialism and how that imprint of the sort of colonial masters sort of remains. And we can see it in our own country, of course, with the tentacles of racism and bias that come from slavery, which I guess my current documentary is looking at. But I started out by just looking at the British version, of that, and I just looked at different moments in Grenada's history. So, if any of you have been to the Caribbean, the Caribs and the British and French were surviving. There was a slave rebellion, and then up into the 20th century, there was the political coup of Morris Bishop, which socialism or communism, and then of course Ronald Reagan and the intervention of the United States. So those were the things that I looked at.
Yeah. Nobody, you guys are awfully quiet.
That's okay. I think I guess I'm glad you all checked in, and I think you can find it on PBS.
Yes. And thank you so much, Valerie. You've always been a great partner with the museum, and we love having you, and you're always welcome here, of course. Come out anytime. And
all right.
Yeah, we're open. So come on out and hang out and enjoy the weather now that it's a little bit warming up again.
Yeah.
And also we will have another lecture next week. We're going to be joined with another FSU professor who's going to be talking about guns and gun sales during COVID-19 and kind of the sociological impact of a pandemic and what it does to kind of the personal preservation and security thoughts and ideas behind a pandemic. So if you guys are interested, please check out our social media, check out our Facebook. It's also already up on our webpage, so the link is there. You can go ahead and get registered for that. So we will see you next week at 6 p.m. on Thursday.
Okay.
Have a good week, everybody. You guys stay safe, and we will see you then.
Okay. Bye, Lacey. Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.